is not real. This one means you are forcing it to fail, to take it out of resolving, to be in primary or secondary. Okay. Number 5 challenge. Latency, for the most part, due to physical distance or network. Oh, sorry. A network. And I'm going to explain this. So, you know, data synchronized from primary to secondary, right? Over the network or over network. But if your servers or your nodes are physically distant, very distant apart, for example, let's say you have a primary node in New York and you have a secondary node in California. Even on the map, you can see how far apart those places are. So due to that physical distance, no matter how strong your network or your internet is, you will experience some latency. Because even you as a human being, for you to fly from New York to California, it will take some time, right? So the same thing for the data to move through the network from New York to Cali, it will take some time. So there will be some slowness. So due to physical distance and sometimes due to network. So even if they are in the same data center, if your network is not strong, you will still experience latency. And if your network is strong, but the physical distance is much, you will experience latency. And it gets worse. It gets worse when you have a long physical distance and then you go and set your availability mode to synchronous. And the latency gets worse. So it gets worse with long physical distance. And I will explain why. All right, so normally synchronous commit mode is slow. It causes latency because transactions will first be committed on the secondary before they get committed on the primary. Which means the primary server would have to wait to get acknowledgement from the secondary server that the transactions have been committed. So now let's use the real life scenario. So whenever they make a change, let's say we have our primary node in New York and we have the secondary node in, let's do some drawing. Control 1 is what I use. Oh, sorry. Control 2, Control W, okay. So let's say this is my primary node, is in New York. My secondary node is in Cali. So if I'm using synchronous commit mode, whenever we make a change on the server here in New York, the change will first be committed on the secondary. Those transactions will go here. They will first be committed here. Then this server will now send acknowledgement back to New York. Like, okay, these transactions have been committed before those transactions now get committed here. This is why synchronous commit mode causes latency. Because the primary would have to wait to receive acknowledgement from the secondary that the transactions have been committed. Before this primary would now send new transactions, number 1, and also before it will receive new transactions from the application. We're going to draw the application here. So let me chip the application here. Let me put it here. So you have the app server here. This is your app server, also a computer. And between the app server and the primary node, we have, what do we have here? I'm already written it out for you guys. We have the listener. So these are data flows. App to listener, listener to primary, from primary to secondary. So the primary server will not keep getting data from the application until it gets acknowledgement that the previous transaction that it received have been committed. Then it will now commit them on itself and then receive new transactions from the application. So there's that slowness because of that wait. Okay, because of that wait, there's that slowness, and that wait is what we call that's what is called HA. Forgive my writing, HADR sync commit. If you, for those that are already working, probably would have seen this before when you run SP_wiz active. If you have always on, you see this wait, HADR sync commit, which means you are experiencing this wait because you are using because the servers are waiting for transaction to be synchronized or to be committed. And this is common when you're using synchronous mode. HADR means high availability disaster recovery synchronization commit. So that is with synchronization, with synchronous mode. So now, like I said, it gets worse when they're now distant apart. So now imagine this secondary server now. Okay, even if they're in the same data center, you still experience that, what is it called? The latency. Imagine when it's now far away, like California. Before the data will go from primary, from New York to Cali, before it gets synchronized, it gets committed, before Cali will now acknowledge back to New York. See, then it gets worse. That latency gets worse with physical distance. Any questions? So that's why when if you have an always-on setup where your nodes are not in the same data center, do not use synchronous commit. Use what?
Asynchronous.
Asynchronous. Asynchronous. Asynchronous. This is what you would use if your servers are, distant apart. You use asynchronous. That way you will avoid that latency. And with asynchronous, the transactions get committed on the primary first. It's like it's not even like, it's the opposite of synchronous. With synchronous, the transactions get committed on the secondary first, the secondary send acknowledgement to the primary, and then they will now get committed on the primary, and then the primary will now receive new. But with asynchronous, the transactions get committed on the primary first, and then the primary will now send those transactions to the secondary at its own time, at its own speed. There's no pressure, no rush. So, and because the primary server does not wait to get any response from the secondary, there's no slowness between the app server and the primary server. So the app server keeps sending transactions to the primary. It doesn't have to wait. It keeps sending it. The primary will commit them and then send it to the secondary when it at its own speed. It's not usually long, but there's no pressure. So with asynchronous, you don't experience much latency because the primary does not have to wait. Okay, but with asynchronous, there's a catch. You can have data loss because just your data, the transactions that are already committed on the primary are not yet committed on the secondary. So if your primary server goes down for whatever reason, and you have to fail over to the secondary, remember that those transactions are not yet on the secondary. So you may be losing data. All right. So how do we fix this one? Solution. Use a synchronous mode. Another challenge. So if you are setting up always on, it is recommended that all nodes should be the exact replica of one another. All nodes should be exact replica. So the way you configure node A, which is the primary, is the exact same way you have to configure node B. So the drive that your data file is saving to and primary should be the same drive your data file is saving to the secondary. Where your log is going to should be, so they have to be exactly the same. Apart from that, the space you are giving those drives should be exactly the same. If disk D on the primary has 500 gig, disk D on the secondary should also have 500 gig. If disk, like twin, identical twin, yeah. So that's another challenge. So if you are running out of space on the primary, you don't just say, oh, infrastructure team, please add storage on the primary node for me. No, as they are adding on the primary node, they need to be adding the exact amount of storage on the secondary, or if you have one, but if you have multiple, on all of the secondaries. And then, yeah, I mean, that's the solution of that one. I don't even know how to write that one. Just whatever you do on primary, do to secondary. That's the solution. Okay, I just write it there. Make same changes or configuration on all nodes. And then last but not the